I never expected my peaceful mountain retirement to turn into a legal nightmare, but when Brenda Patterson from the Cascade Ridge HOA showed up at my door with that pinched expression and a manila folder full of complaints, I knew my quiet life was about to get complicated. My name is Henry Quinlan, and I had moved to the small community of Cascade Ridge in the Colorado Rockies 3 years ago after selling my construction business in Denver. The place was perfect, nestled at 9,000 feet with enough snow to make every winter feel like Christmas. I had bought a spacious cabin on 5 acres at the edge of the development, specifically choosing a property that backed up to national forest land. The bonus was my detached garage that housed my pride and joy, a 1998 Tucker Snowcat that I had restored myself over 2 years. The Snowcat was not just a hobby, it was essential. Every weekend from December through March, I would fire up that beast at dawn and spend hours grooming the network of cross-country ski trails that wound through the national forest behind our community. The Forest Service had given me a volunteer permit years ago, grateful that someone was willing to maintain the trails for free. Before I started, those trails had been a mess of moguls, ice patches, and fallen branches. Now they were pristine, attracting skiers from 3 counties over. It was a Saturday morning in early January when Brenda knocked. I had just finished my breakfast and was pulling on my insulated coveralls, preparing for my usual trail grooming run. Through the window, I could see fresh powder blanketing everything, probably 8 inches from the overnight storm. Perfect grooming conditions. I opened the door to find Brenda standing there with 2 other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards. Brenda was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut and wearing a puffy jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. To her left was Gerald Morrison, the treasurer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who always looked vaguely uncomfortable. On her right stood Patricia Hoffman, the secretary, a woman who seemed to communicate exclusively through disapproving sniffs. "Henry," Brenda said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your weekend activities." "My weekend activities?" I leaned against the doorframe, genuinely confused. "You mean grooming the ski trails?" "That machine of yours," Patricia said, her nose wrinkling like she smelled something foul. "It is absolutely unacceptable." I blinked. "The Snowcat? What about it?" Brenda opened her manila folder with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "We have received 17 complaints over the past month about the noise disturbance. Your machine starts operating at 6:30 in the morning on weekend days when people are trying to sleep in. The engine noise carries across the entire valley. The HOA bylaws clearly state that no motorized recreational vehicles may be operated before 9 a.m. on weekends," Gerald added, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Section 12, paragraph 4. I felt my jaw tighten. First of all, it is not a recreational vehicle. I am performing a community service, maintaining public trails. Second, I have to start early because it takes 4 hours to groom the entire network, and if I wait until 9, the snow gets tracked up by early skiers, and the grooming is pointless." "That is not our concern," Brenda said flatly. "The rules are the rules. We are hereby issuing you a formal violation notice. You must cease and desist all Snowcat operations before 9 a.m. on weekends, effective immediately. Continued violations will result in fines of $250 per incident." "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea how many people use those trails? Families, kids, elderly folks, serious athletes training for competitions? I am out there every single weekend making sure those trails are safe." "Perhaps you should consider grooming on weekdays instead," Patricia suggested with a sniff. "I work contract jobs during the week," I said, fighting to keep my temper in check. "The weekends are the only time I can do this. And besides, the trails get the most traffic on weekends, which means they need to be groomed Saturday and Sunday mornings." "Then I suppose the trails will have to go ungroomed," Brenda said, closing her folder with a snap. "We have spoken to the Forest Service. They confirmed your permit is voluntary, and the government has no obligation to maintain these trails. If you choose not to groom them, that is between you and your conscience. But you will follow HOA regulations, Henry. Consider this your only warning." They turned and walked back to Brenda's white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing in the doorway, stunned and furious. I looked back at my Snowcat sitting in the garage, already warmed up and ready to go. Then I looked at the clock. 6:45 a.m. I was already violating their arbitrary rule. For a long moment, I considered ignoring them and heading out anyway. But the threat of $250 fines added up quickly. 4 weekends a month, 2 days each weekend. That was $2,000 a month if they decided to enforce it strictly. I had savings, but I was not about to bankrupt myself over this. With a heavy heart, I shut down the Snowcat and went back inside. The next weekend, I tried Brenda's suggestion, as absurd as it was. I waited until 9 a.m. to start my grooming run. By then, dozens of skiers had already hit the trails. I could see them from my property, gliding along in the early morning light, taking advantage of the fresh snow from Friday night's storm. When I finally got the Snowcat out onto the trails at 9:15, the damage was already done. The main trail, a wide thoroughfare that served as the backbone of the network, was churned up with ski tracks going in every direction. The side trails were worse. Without proper grooming, the snow had been packed down unevenly, creating bumps and ridges that would only get worse with more traffic. I did my best, but grooming tracked up snow is like trying to comb wet hair that is already tangled. The results were mediocre at best. I could feel my frustration building with every pass. This was not maintaining trails. This was just rearranging the mess. By the time I finished and headed back, it was almost 2 in the afternoon. I had missed the entire morning, and the trails were still in lousy condition. As I was putting the Snowcat away, I saw a group of skiers coming back from the forest, and I recognized one of them. Tom Hendricks, a local guy in his 60s who had been skiing these trails for 20 years. "Henry," he called out, waving me over. His face was flushed from exertion, but he was frowning. "What happened to the trails today? They are usually perfect when you have done them, but it was pretty rough out there." I explained the situation, watching his expression shift from confusion to anger. "That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard," Tom said. "These trails are the best thing about Cascade Ridge. People drive from Breckenridge and Vail to ski here. The HOA is going to ruin them over noise complaints?" "Apparently," I said, shaking my head. "I tried grooming after 9 like they wanted, but you can see how well that worked." "This is Brenda's doing, is not it?" Tom said knowingly. "She moved here 2 years ago from California and has been trying to turn this place into some kind of country club ever since. Last year she tried to ban Christmas lights that were not white or gold, said colored lights were tacky." "Sounds about right," I muttered. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "Do not let her push you around. A lot of us depend on those trails. I will talk to some people, see if we can get some pressure on the board." I appreciated the sentiment, but I was not optimistic. HOAs in Colorado had broad authority, and Brenda seemed like the type who thrived on exercising power over her neighbors. The following weekend was worse. I stuck to the 9 a.m. rule again, and this time the trails had 2 full days of ungroomed traffic from the week, plus fresh snow on Thursday night that had been skied over all day Friday and Saturday morning. When I got out there, the conditions were genuinely dangerous. Icy patches had formed where skiers had packed down the snow, and the uneven surface had created hidden divots and bumps. I spent 6 hours trying to salvage things, missing most of the daylight. When I finally called it quits, I knew the trails were still substandard. I had gone from being proud of my work to feeling ashamed of what I was putting out there. That evening, my phone rang. It was Linda Garcia, the manager of the Forest Service district office in Summit County. "Henry, I've been getting calls," she said, her tone concerned. "People are complaining about the trail conditions. Is everything okay?" I filled her in on the HOA situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That is unfortunate," Linda finally said. "I appreciate all the work you have been doing. Those trails were a nightmare before you took over. But I have to be honest with you, Henry. If the trail conditions become hazardous, I may have to close them. We cannot have people getting injured on Forest Service land because of poor maintenance." "I understand," I said, though her words felt like a punch to the gut. "I am doing the best I can under the circumstances." "I know you are," she said gently. "But the safety of the public has to come first. I will give it a few more weeks and see how things go. Hopefully you can work something out with your HOA." After we hung up, I sat in my living room, staring out at the dark forest. 3 years of work, building up these trails, creating something the whole community could enjoy, and it was all being destroyed because Brenda Patterson could not handle a little engine noise on Saturday mornings. I decided to try reasoning with her one more time. On Tuesday evening, I drove to her house, a massive log mansion near the center of the development. Her husband, Richard, answered the door. He was a quiet man who worked in finance and seemed to spend most of his time trying to stay out of his wife's way. "Is Brenda available?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable. "She is in her office. I will get her." A minute later, Brenda appeared, her expression already set in disapproval. "Henry, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk about the grooming schedule," I said, trying to keep my voice level and reasonable. "The 9 a.m. restriction is making it impossible to maintain the trails properly. Could we compromise? Maybe I could start at 8 a.m. on weekends? That is still later than I used to, but it would give me enough time to get ahead of the traffic." "The rule is 9 a.m., Brenda said firmly. "It was put in place after careful consideration and a vote of the board. We are not going to change it for one person." "But it is not just about me," I pressed. "It is about everyone who uses those trails. They are getting dangerous, Brenda. Someone is going to get hurt." "Then perhaps they should not use them," she said, crossing her arms. "Or perhaps you should find a quieter machine. I have done research, and there are electric snow groomers available, completely silent." "They cost over $100,000, I said, incredulous. "I cannot afford that. I am doing this as a volunteer service." "That sounds like a personal problem," Brenda said coolly. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do. Please remember, Henry, continued violations will result in fines. We have volunteers monitoring the neighborhood every weekend now. Good evening." She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, so angry I was shaking. Then, I walked back to my truck and drove home. When I got there, I made a decision. If the HOA wanted the grooming stopped, then it would stop. I was done trying to work within their absurd restrictions. They wanted to make this difficult? Fine. I would show them exactly what ungrouped trails looked like. That weekend, I did not take the Snowcat out at all. I stayed home, working on projects in my garage, trying not to think about the powder snow going to waste. My phone rang several times with calls from skiers I knew, asking if I was okay, if the grooming was happening. I let most of them go to voicemail. Tom Hendricks came by on Sunday afternoon. "Henry, the trails are a disaster," he said. "There are barely any tracks out there that are safe to ski on. It is all just random paths through the powder." "I know," I said, "but I'm not paying $2,000 a month in HOA fines just to maintain trails. If people do not like it, they can complain to Brenda Patterson." "Oh, they are," Tom said grimly. "I have already heard from at least 20 people who are furious, but you know how HOAs are. Unless you are on the board, your opinion does not matter." "Tell people to start coming to board meetings," I suggested. "They are open to all residents. If enough people show up and complain, maybe it will make a difference." Tom nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea. The next meeting is in 2 weeks. I will spread the word." The winter rolled on, and the trails deteriorated rapidly. Without regular grooming, the snow became an unpredictable mess. Fresh powder would fall, skiers would carve random paths through it, then overnight temperatures would freeze everything into an icy maze of ruts and bumps. The main trail, which used to be smooth as a highway, was now a challenging obstacle course. The narrower side trails became almost unusable. I started hearing stories. An elderly woman from Breckenridge had fallen and sprained her wrist. A teenager had caught his ski in a hidden rut and twisted his knee. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the incidents were adding up. I felt guilty every time I heard about someone getting hurt, but what could I do? The HOA had tied my hands. The February board meeting was packed. Usually these meetings drew maybe 10 people. This time, over 60 residents showed up, cramming into the community center conference room. I sat in the back, watching as Tom and others took turns at the public comment microphone. "The ski trails are in the worst condition I have seen in a decade," said Margaret Foster, a woman in her 70s who had lived in Cascade Ridge since it was founded. "My grandchildren visit every winter to ski those trails. Last week, my grandson hit a patch of ice and nearly broke his collarbone. This is unacceptable." We came here from Denver specifically because of those trails, added David Chen, a younger man who had moved to the area just 6 months ago. They are listed in the community amenities. If they are not being maintained, what exactly are we paying HOA fees for? One by one, they got up and voiced their complaints. Brenda sat at the head table with the rest of the board, her face growing more pinched with each comment. When the public comment period finally ended, she leaned into her microphone. "I understand the concerns," she said in a tight voice. "However, the board has a responsibility to all residents, not just the skiing enthusiasts. The noise ordinance was put in place because of legitimate complaints about early morning disturbances. We cannot simply ignore one set of residents to please another." "Then find a compromise," Tom called out from the audience. "Let Henry start at 8 instead of 9, or 7:30, something that gives him enough time to do the job properly." "The issue is not just the start time," Gerald Morrison interjected, looking at his notes. "We have received complaints about the noise throughout the grooming operation, which can last 4 or 5 hours. Even if Mr. Quinlan started at 9, he would still be running that machine until 2 in the afternoon on weekends." "So what are you suggesting?" asked David Chen. "That we just let the trails turn into a liability hazard?" "We are suggesting that if Mr. Quinlan wishes to continue his volunteer work, he needs to do so in compliance with community regulations," Brenda said firmly. "Perhaps grooming less frequently would be acceptable, once every 2 weeks instead of every weekend." A groan went through the crowd. Everyone who skied regularly knew that once every 2 weeks was nowhere near enough for high traffic trails. "This is absurd," Margaret Foster said, standing up despite her age. "Brenda, you have been on a power trip ever since you joined this board. First, it was the Christmas lights. Then, it was the fence height restrictions. Now, you are destroying the one amenity that makes this community special. Some of us are beginning to wonder if you even belong here." The room erupted in applause. Brenda's face flushed red. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, banging her gavel. "The board will take your comments under advisement." But as the weeks went by, nothing changed. The board held firm on the 9 a.m. restriction. I continued to abstain from grooming, unwilling to either pay the fines or put out substandard work. The trails continued to deteriorate. By mid-February, the Forest Service was getting serious complaints. Linda Garcia called me again, her tone more formal this time. "Henry, I am sorry, but I'm going to have to close the trails," she said. "We have had 3 injury reports filed in the past 2 weeks. One of them is threatening to sue the Forest Service for negligent maintenance. I cannot keep them open in this condition." "I understand," I said, feeling defeated. "This is not your fault, Linda." "Is there really no way to work things out with your HOA?" she asked. "Not unless I want to go bankrupt paying fines," I said. "Brenda Patterson has made it clear she would rather see the trails closed than compromise on her noise ordinance." Linda sighed. What a waste. Those were some of the best maintained volunteer trails in the state. "All right, I will post closure notices this weekend. I am sorry, Henry, you did great work." The closure notices went up on Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, social media was blowing up. The local newspaper, the Summit County Journal, ran a front-page story about it. "Popular ski trails closed due to HOA dispute," read the headline. The article interviewed several skiers, all of them praising my previous work and criticizing the HOA's inflexibility. That afternoon, a news crew from a Denver television station showed up at my door. I gave them an interview, explaining the whole situation as calmly as I could. I showed them the Snowcat, talked about the grooming process, and described how the HOA restrictions had made it impossible to maintain the trails properly. "So, you are saying the HOA chose noise complaints over public safety?" the reporter asked a young woman named Jessica Moreno. "I'm saying they refused to compromise," I replied carefully. "I tried to work with them. I offered multiple solutions. They were not interested." The story aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news. By morning, it had been picked up by the local radio stations and was trending on Colorado Twitter. Suddenly, Cascade Ridge HOA was getting attention nobody wanted. Brenda tried to do damage control, releasing a statement that blamed me for refusing to follow reasonable community standards. But public opinion was heavily against the HOA. The comments on social media were brutal. People were calling Brenda a Karen, demanding she resign, threatening to boycott any businesses in the area that supported the HOA's decision. I started getting calls from other HOA residents, people I barely knew, apologizing for the situation and asking what they could do to help. Someone started an online petition to remove Brenda from the board. Within 3 days, it had over 2,000 signatures. But Brenda was stubborn. She released another statement doubling down, claiming the HOA had every right to enforce its regulations and that the media was unfairly vilifying them. She scheduled an emergency board meeting for the first week of March. I did not attend that meeting. I had said my piece and was tired of banging my head against Brenda's wall of obstinance, but Tom Hendricks was there, and he called me afterward to fill me in. It was a circus, he said. Over 100 people showed up. They had to move it to the community center gym to fit everyone. Person after person got up and demanded the board reverse the noise ordinance. Brenda kept insisting they were protecting residents' rights to peace and quiet. "Let me guess," I said. She did not back down. "Worse," Tom said. She actually doubled down. She proposed a new rule that would ban all motorized equipment on HOA properties before 10 a.m. on weekends. Lawnmowers, snowblowers, everything. I laughed bitterly. She is unbelievable. "There is more," Tom continued. "After the meeting, a bunch of us went to Elk Meadow Bar to commiserate. One of the guys there, Steve Latham, he lives 3 doors down from Brenda. He said he has never once complained about your Snowcat. In fact, he said he barely hears it from his house because of the way the valley acoustics work." "Then who filed the 17 complaints?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. "That is the thing," Tom said. "Steve got curious and filed a public records request with the HOA. They have to release complaint records to homeowners. Guess what he found out?" "What?" "Of the 17 complaints, 9 came from Brenda herself. 5 came from Patricia Hoffman, 2 came from Gerald Morrison. Only 1 came from an actual resident, and that resident lives clear on the other side of the development, over a mile from your place. There is no way they could even hear the Snowcat from there." I felt my blood pressure rising. "So this whole thing was manufactured by the board?" "It looks that way," Tom said. "Steve is putting together all the documentation. He is talking about filing a complaint with the county, maybe even a lawsuit for abuse of power. This could get really messy for them." Over the next week, the situation escalated. Steve Latham shared his findings on the community Facebook page, and people were outraged. It turned out Brenda had been systematically filing false complaints to justify the noise ordinance, which most residents suspected was really about her personal dislike of me. Several people came forward with stories of previous run-ins with Brenda, painting a picture of an authoritarian busybody who used HOA regulations to bully her neighbors. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story with the headline, "HOA, Board Accused of Filing False Complaints to Justify Trail Closure." The television station did another segment. This time, they interviewed Brenda, and it went poorly for her. She came across as defensive and dismissive, at one point telling the reporter that people need to understand that rules exist for a reason when asked why she had filed multiple complaints about a noise that barely reached her property. I thought things could not get worse for the HOA, but then someone got injured. Badly. It was a Tuesday in mid-March. I was working on a contract job, inspecting a construction site in Frisco, when I got a call from Linda Garcia at the Forest Service. "Henry, we have a situation," she said, her voice tense. "A skier went out on the closed trails this morning. He went through one of the barrier tapes and hit a section where the snow had melted and refrozen into sheet ice. Lost control, went off the trail, and hit a tree. He is being airlifted to Denver with a severe head injury and multiple broken bones." My stomach dropped. Jesus Christ, is he going to be okay? "They do not know yet," Linda said. "But that is not all. His wife is already talking to lawyers. She is saying the Forest Service should have done more to prevent access to the trails. And she is saying the trails should never have been closed in the first place, that this is the fault of whoever stopped maintaining them." "This is going to come back on me," I said, feeling sick. "It might," Linda admitted. "I have already been contacted by her attorney. They are investigating the whole situation. You should probably talk to a lawyer yourself, Henry. I'm sorry." I spent that afternoon in a daze. The injured skier was a 42-year-old man named Marcus Webb, visiting from Boulder with his family for a ski vacation. He had apparently ignored the closure signs, thinking he would be fine on the trails even without grooming. The icy conditions had proved him catastrophically wrong. By evening, the story was everywhere. "Man critically injured on closed ski trails," ran the headlines. The story included background about the HOA dispute, and suddenly my name was in every article as the volunteer who had stopped grooming due to HOA regulations. I got hate messages on social media from people who did not know the full story, blaming me for the accident. I also got supportive messages from locals who understood I had been forced into an impossible situation. My phone would not stop ringing. I finally turned it off and sat in my dark living room, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I had just been trying to help people, to maintain trails for the community to enjoy. Now a man was fighting for his life in a hospital, and I was potentially facing a lawsuit. The next morning, there was a sheriff's deputy at my door. My heart sank when I saw the patrol car in my driveway. "Henry Quinlan?" he asked when I opened the door. "That is me," I said. "I am Deputy Marshal. I need to ask you some questions about the closed ski trails and the grooming operation you were running. Can I come in?" I let him in, and we sat at my kitchen table while he took notes. He asked about my grooming schedule, the HOA dispute, the reasons I had stopped maintaining the trails, and my communication with the Forest Service. I answered everything honestly, showing him the violation notice from the HOA and the emails with Linda Garcia. Am I in some kind of trouble?" I finally asked. Deputy Marshal closed his notebook. "Not at this point. We are just gathering information. The injured man's family is claiming negligence by multiple parties. The district attorney is trying to figure out if there is any criminal liability. From what I can see, you were volunteering your time and equipment until you were prevented from doing so by HOA regulations. But I am not the one who makes that determination." After he left, I sat down and called a lawyer. I found one in Breckenridge who specialized in property disputes and liability cases. Her name was Rachel Zimmerman, and she agreed to meet with me that afternoon. "This is a complicated situation," Rachel said after I explained everything. "The good news is you were a volunteer, not a paid contractor. That gives you some legal protection. You were also prevented from performing the maintenance by a third party, the HOA, which creates a break in the chain of liability. The bad news is that these kinds of cases can still be expensive to defend, even if you ultimately win." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Free. First, do not talk to anyone about this without me present," she said. "That includes the press, the sheriff, the Forest Service, and especially the injured man's attorneys if they contact you. Second, I'm going to start gathering evidence to show that you acted reasonably and responsibly throughout this situation. That means getting statements from other residents, documentation of your communication with the HOA and Forest Service, and expert opinions on trail maintenance standards." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, dreading the answer. "My retainer is $5,000, Rachel said. "If this goes to litigation, it could run another $20,000 to $50,000, but hopefully it will not come to that. A lot depends on what happens with Marcus Webb. If he recovers, the lawsuit might go away. If he does not," she trailed off, leaving the grim implication hanging. I paid her retainer and left feeling even more depressed than when I had arrived. I had done nothing wrong, but I was still looking at potential financial ruin. The story continued to dominate local news. Marcus Webb was in critical but stable condition, which was better than the initial reports but still serious. He had a fractured skull, broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a shattered leg. Even if he survived, he was looking at months of recovery. The public turned its fury on the Cascade Ridge HOA. The state representative for our district, a woman named Lydia Brennan, issued a statement calling for an investigation into HOA abuses of power. The Summit County Commissioners held an emergency meeting to discuss whether they could intervene in HOA governance. And then the lawsuit started flying. Marcus Webb's wife, Sharon Webb, filed suit against the Forest Service, the Cascade Ridge HOA, and me personally, seeking damages for medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. The amount was unspecified, but described as substantial. 2 days later, Steve Latham and 12 other Cascade Ridge residents filed their own lawsuit against the HOA board, claiming abuse of authority, filing false complaints, and misappropriation of HOA funds. They alleged that Brenda had been using HOA money to hire lawyers to defend the noise ordinance rather than for legitimate community purposes. The HOA, in turn, filed a countersuit against me, claiming I had violated community regulations and brought negative publicity that had damaged property values in Cascade Ridge. They demanded $50,000 in damages. It was insane. My peaceful retirement had turned into a legal apocalypse, all because I had tried to maintain some ski trails. Rachel Zimmerman worked quickly, building our defense. She deposed Linda Garcia, who testified that I had been an exemplary volunteer and had made multiple good faith efforts to comply with HOA regulations while still maintaining the trails. She got statements from dozens of skiers who praised my work and described how the trails had deteriorated after I was forced to stop grooming. Most importantly, she obtained the HOA's internal complaint records, the same ones Steve Latham had requested. When analyzed, they showed a clear pattern of manufactured complaints from board members, not actual residents. Only 3 legitimate complaints had been filed about Snowcat noise in 3 years, and all 3 were from people who lived over a mile away and had likely just heard about it secondhand. Rachel also brought in an expert witness, a professor from Colorado State University who specialized in winter recreation management. He reviewed my grooming practices, the trail conditions before and after the HOA restrictions, and the circumstances of Marcus Webb's injury. His opinion was unequivocal. I had been maintaining the trails to professional standards. The deterioration after I stopped was predictable and dangerous, and Marcus Webb's injury was a direct result of skiing on poorly maintained trails. As the evidence mounted, the legal landscape began to shift. Sharon Webb's attorney reached out to Rachel for settlement discussions. The Forest Service's lawyers reviewing the case concluded that the agency bore no real liability since they had properly closed the trails once they became dangerous. That left the HOA and me as the primary defendants. In a mediation session in late April, Sharon Webb's attorney laid out their position. "My client's husband suffered life-altering injuries," he said. "Someone needs to be held accountable. The question is whether it is Mr. Quinlan who stopped maintaining the trails or the HOA who prevented him from maintaining them." "The HOA," Rachel said firmly. "Mr. Quinlan was performing a volunteer service and made every reasonable effort to continue doing so safely. The HOA issued baseless complaints and imposed arbitrary restrictions that made safe trail maintenance impossible. When Mr. Quinlan explained the consequences, they doubled down. This injury is the direct result of the HOA's actions." The HOA's lawyer, a nervous-looking man named Paul Fredericks, tried to argue that the HOA had a right to enforce its regulations. But when Rachel presented the evidence of false complaints and Brenda's personal vendetta, his defense crumbled. "Your clients manufactured a problem to justify a policy that served no legitimate purpose," Rachel said coldly. "They were warned repeatedly that their actions would lead to dangerous trail conditions. They ignored those warnings. And now a man is permanently disabled because of their negligence and abuse of power." The mediation ended without a settlement, but the direction was clear. The HOA was going to be held responsible. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb woke up. He had been in a medically induced coma to manage his brain swelling, and doctors had finally determined he was stable enough to regain consciousness. The news was cautiously optimistic. He would survive, but he faced a long recovery and might have permanent cognitive impairment. Sharon Webb, who had been camped out at the hospital for weeks, finally returned to Cascade Ridge. Rachel arranged for me to meet with her. I was terrified, expecting her to be hostile and angry. Instead, she was exhausted and sad. "I do not blame you," she said when we sat down in Rachel's office. "My lawyer explained what happened. You were just trying to help people, and the HOA stopped you. Marcus should not have gone on those trails after they were closed, but he did not realize how dangerous they had become. He thought it would be like all the other times he had skied there." "I am so sorry," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "If I could go back and change things, I would." She nodded. "I know. I just want to make sure Marcus is taken care of. The medical bills are already over $300,000, and they will keep climbing. We had insurance, but it does not cover everything. Can you help me understand what my options are?" Rachel stepped in. The HOA has liability insurance with a $5 million policy limit. Based on the evidence we have, I believe they are responsible for your husband's injuries. We can pursue a settlement with their insurer, which would cover Marcus's medical expenses, lost wages, and ongoing care needs. That would leave Mr. Quinlan out of the lawsuit entirely. I just want what is fair, Sharon said. I do not want to destroy anyone's life over this. It has already destroyed enough lives. Over the next month, the settlement negotiations intensified. The HOA's insurance company reviewed the case and came to the same conclusion everyone else had. The HOA was liable. They offered an initial settlement of $1.2 million. Sharon's lawyer countered with $3 million. They eventually settled at $2.4 million, which would cover Marcus's medical care, lost income, and provide for his future needs. As part of the settlement, the HOA agreed to rescind the noise ordinance and issue a formal apology to me. They also agreed not to interfere with my trail grooming activities in the future. But the story was not over yet. The residents' lawsuit against the HOA board was still moving forward, and it was gaining steam. Steve Latham and his co-plaintiffs had expanded their complaint to include multiple instances of HOA abuse beyond just the ski trail issue. They documented how Brenda had used HOA funds to hire lawyers for personal disputes, how she had selectively enforced rules against people she did not like, and how she had intimidated residents who questioned her authority. The discovery process revealed even more damning information. Brenda's emails, which were HOA records and therefore subject to disclosure, showed a pattern of vindictive behavior. In one email to Patricia Hoffman, she wrote, "I cannot stand that Henry Quinlan thinks he is some kind of hero. We need to shut down his little operation and put him in his place." In another, she discussed filing noise complaints to create a paper trail for enforcement action. The Summit County District Attorney's Office took notice. Filing false complaints to a government agency is a crime in Colorado, and using HOA funds for personal vendettas could be considered embezzlement. In early June, criminal charges were filed against Brenda Patterson and Patricia Hoffman. The charges were serious, 3 counts each of filing false reports, 1 count of official misconduct, and 2 counts of theft for misusing HOA funds. Gerald Morrison was not charged, as investigators determined he had been largely unaware of Brenda's schemes and had simply gone along with her directives. I was sitting on my deck when I saw the news vans pull up to Brenda's house. Within an hour, footage of her being led out in handcuffs was on every local channel. Her face was a mask of shock and indignation, and she was shouting something about persecution and unfair targeting. Patricia Hoffman was arrested at her home the same day. Unlike Brenda, she looked defeated and scared, probably realizing the magnitude of what she had gotten herself into by going along with Brenda's plans. The community reaction was swift. The HOA board called an emergency meeting and voted to remove both women from their positions. Gerald Morrison resigned voluntarily. 3 new board members were elected in a special vote, all of them residents who had been vocal critics of the previous board's overreach. The criminal trial was set for September. Both Brenda and Patricia initially pleaded not guilty, but as more evidence came to light, their lawyers began negotiating plea deals. Brenda, as the primary instigator, was facing the most serious consequences. In August, she finally accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of filing false reports and 1 count of official misconduct. The other charges were dropped. She was sentenced to 1 year in county jail, with 6 months suspended pending good behavior, plus 3 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the legal fees and settlement costs her actions had caused, a total of over $200,000. Patricia Hoffman got a lighter sentence since she had been following Brenda's lead rather than initiating the misconduct. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of filing a false report and received 6 months of probation and 100 hours of community service. With the legal matters finally resolved, I was able to get back to what I loved: grooming the trails. The Forest Service reopened them in late June, though summer had arrived and there was no snow to groom. I spent the off-season doing maintenance on the Snowcat and repairing some of the trail markers that had been damaged over the winter. Marcus Webb continued his recovery. I visited him once in July, driving down to Boulder where he was doing intensive rehabilitation. He was in a wheelchair, but working hard with physical therapists to relearn how to walk. His speech was slightly slurred from the brain injury, but his mind was sharp. "I heard what you went through," he said when I arrived. "Sharon told me everything. I'm sorry my accident caused you so much trouble." "Do not apologize," I said. "I'm just glad you're okay. Relatively speaking." He gave me a wry smile. "I will probably never ski again. Maybe that is for the best. I clearly made a bad decision going on those trails when they were closed. You could not have known how bad they had gotten," I said. "That is on the HOA, not you." We talked for an hour about the mountains, skiing, and the strange turn all our lives had taken. Before I left, he made me promise to send him pictures of the groomed trails once winter came back. "I want to see them looking beautiful again," he said. "That will make me feel better about this whole mess." The new HOA board was a completely different experience. They called me in for a meeting in August, and I went expecting more conflict. Instead, they thanked me for my years of volunteer service and asked what they could do to support the trail grooming operation. "Honestly," I said, "just leave me alone to do my work. That's all I have ever wanted." The new board president, Margaret Foster, the elderly woman who had spoken up at the contentious meeting, smiled. "That we can do. We are also going to amend the HOA bylaws to specifically exempt community volunteer activities from noise ordinances. What you do benefits everyone, and it should be protected." They followed through on that promise. By September, the new noise ordinance exemptions were in place. It also included language preventing future boards from filing complaints on behalf of non-existent residents and requiring transparency in enforcement actions. When the first snow fell in November, I was ready. I woke up at 5:30 on a Saturday morning, made my coffee, and headed out to the garage. The Snowcat fired up with its familiar rumble, and I felt a surge of joy I had not experienced in months. The trails were in rough shape after a year of neglect. The forest had reclaimed parts of them, with fallen branches and brush encroaching on the paths. But I worked steadily, clearing obstacles and laying down smooth, groomed tracks. By noon, the main trail was pristine, a perfect ribbon of corduroy snow winding through the evergreens. Skiers started showing up by early afternoon, and I could hear their whoops of joy as they glided along the trails. Tom Hendricks skied over to where I was grooming a side trail and gave me a thumbs up. "Idi, it is good to have you back, Henry," he shouted over the engine noise. I waved back, grinning. It felt good to be doing this again, to be creating something beautiful and useful for people to enjoy. Over the following weeks, word spread that the Cascade Ridge trails were open and groomed again. Skiers came from all over the region, and the community flourished. Local businesses saw increased traffic from visitors. Property values, which had dipped during the controversy, began to recover. The Summit County Journal ran a feature story in December with the headline, "Cascade Ridge Trails Make Triumphant Return After Turbulent Year." The article included interviews with skiers, Forest Service officials, and the new HOA board. There was even a quote from Sharon Webb, who said she was glad the trails were back in operation and hoped they would bring joy to families for years to come. I kept in touch with Marcus throughout the winter. I sent him photos every week of the freshly groomed trails, and he sent back messages of appreciation. By February, he was walking with a cane and had regained most of his cognitive function. He would never be the same as before the accident, but he was alive and making progress. Brenda Patterson served her jail time at the Summit County Detention Center. I never visited her, and she never attempted to contact me. After her release in March, she and her husband quietly moved away from Cascade Ridge. I heard through the grapevine that they had relocated to Arizona, presumably to escape the notoriety and judgment of their former neighbors. Patricia Hoffman completed her probation in community service, but remained in Cascade Ridge. She kept a very low profile, and I would occasionally see her at the grocery store. We never spoke. The residents' lawsuit against the former HOA board was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The money was used to establish a community fund for trail maintenance and other volunteer activities, ensuring that future generations would benefit from the work people like me did. As the second winter of normal operations approached, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a nightmare, no question about it. I had been threatened, sued, vilified, and nearly bankrupted. A man had been gravely injured, and lives had been permanently altered. But through it all, the community had come together. People who had been strangers became allies. An abusive HOA board had been held accountable, and the trails that meant so much to so many people had been saved. On a clear Saturday morning in January, I was out grooming the back loop trail when I came across a new sign that had been installed by the Forest Service. It was a wooden post with a plaque that read, "Quinlan Trail Network, maintained by volunteer Henry Quinlan since 2022. These trails are a gift to the community, groomed with care and dedication every winter. Thank you, Henry, for your service." I sat there on the Snowcat for a long moment, reading and rereading those words. I had not done this for recognition or praise. I had done it because I loved the mountains, loved skiing, and wanted to share that joy with others. But seeing my work acknowledged, knowing that the community appreciated what I did, made all the struggles worthwhile. I took a picture of the sign and sent it to Marcus Webb. His response came back quickly. "That's beautiful. You deserve it. Keep up the great work." I fired up the Snowcat again and continued grooming. The morning sun broke over the peaks, casting golden light through the pine trees. The snow sparkled like diamonds. Behind me, the trail stretched out smooth and perfect, ready for the skiers who would soon arrive. This was why I did it. Not for gratitude or recognition, but for mornings like this. For the knowledge that I was creating something good in the world, something that brought people together and gave them joy. The HOA had tried to stop me. They had thrown regulations and threats and lawsuits in my path. They had caused tremendous damage and suffering in their petty quest for control. But in the end, the trails had won. The community had won. And I was still here, doing the work I loved, in the place I called home. As I completed the final loop and headed back toward my property, I thought about the year ahead. There would be more storms, more powder days, more weekends of getting up before dawn to groom. There would be maintenance issues with the Snowcat, cold mornings when I did not want to leave my warm house, and probably a few more conflicts with difficult neighbors. But there would also be the satisfaction of a job well done, the smiles on children's faces as they learned to ski, the grateful waves from elderly couples enjoying a peaceful morning glide through the forest, the knowledge that I was making a difference in my small corner of the world. The Cascade Ridge trails had become more than just a volunteer project. They were a testament to the idea that one person, armed with determination and the willingness to stand up for what was right, could overcome even the most obstinate opposition. They were proof that communities could heal from conflict and come out stronger on the other side. As I pulled the Snowcat into my garage and shut down the engine, I felt a deep sense of peace. The ordeal was over. Justice had been served. The trails were saved, and I could get back to the simple pleasure of doing good work for good people. Tomorrow, there would be more snow, more trails to groom, more skiers to serve. And I would be there, ready and willing, doing what I had always done, taking care of the mountains and the people who loved them. The HOA had demanded I stop running my Snowcat on weekends, and their ski trail had become a death trap, just as I had warned them it would. But that chapter was closed now. The new chapter was about renewal, community, and the simple joy of making perfectly groomed tracks through fresh powder snow. And that was exactly how I wanted my story to continue, one groomed trail at a time, for as many winters as I had left in me.